What is up, track stars? The moment you have been waiting for. It has been almost an entire week. And here we are. We're going to do the breakdown of the movie Nefarious. Yay! Okay. I have worked on this for at least 6 hours. So bear with me. There's a lot to explain, a lot to uncover. And most of you are probably like 6 hours. The movie's an hour and a half. Yes, 6 hours, because guess who had to pause and play for all them 6 hours to uncover everything hidden that goes over people's heads that most people are wanting to know. Okay, so track stars, bear with me. I am actually splitting this into two separate episodes because the explanation is that long and that deep. And before I get into this, right, before we dive into this, I just want to stress that this is purely for entertainment and educational purposes only. I do not own this movie. I don't own the rights to stream it, but I can talk about it. So, with that being said, again, to those who have not watched the movie, right? This is a spoiler episode, and so will the next. We'll also continue the spoilers of this movie. Okay? Fair warning. So, for those of you that have watched the movie, this is definitely a special treat for you because I can almost assure you if you've only watched the movie once, there's too much little details, intricate things that have gone over your head. And for those who haven't watched the movie but are going to, but still want to listen to this anyway, don't worry. There's stuff in there for you to inspire you to actually slow down and watch the movie more than one time. Because I watched it twice. First time with Macman, my brother, shout outs to you. You my fellow for life. The second time, I had to watch by myself while also doing some research, some biblical research. So this is a treat, okay? So, because I'm not showing any images because this is a pre-record and I don't want to get hit with any copyright infringement or any of those nasty things that YouTube might get my channel struck for. Okay, I'm gonna be explaining a lot of the significance of the things down to certain things being worn, names, biblical references, all of those things. So, for those of you guys that like to watch movies with little Easter eggs, this is for you, but on a spiritual level. So, to set the tone of this movie, right? This movie, the setting is an Oklahoma prison. Now, you have the character Nefarious. You also have the character Edward. Edward and Nefarious share the same body. So that's very important to note. For those of you who may be confused throughout this, this is for reference. Now, we also have James, which is the story's protagonist, the atheist psychologist who's too smart for his own good. Okay. We also will refer to a previous psychologist whose name was Dr. Fisher. He plays a role in this as well. We also have Lou, which is a priest or the prison's chaplain. We're going to look into him as well. And there's a few other characters that Well, specifically one other character that we're going to save for part two, and her name is Melanie. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. So, ultimately, this movie proves how, as spiritual beings on this earth, and this being Satan's playground, because he was given dominion over the earth, that it's a lot easier to control people's thoughts that evil doesn't exist, even when it stares at you directly in the face. That is the premise of Nefarious, aka Edward, versus the protagonist, James. Right? And one of the things I also want to make note of for those who have seen the movie, you see what James is wearing versus what Edward slash Nefarious is wearing. James is wearing a blue suit with a white collar shirt. And to those who may be questioning what, that may mean, in my humble opinion, majority of these views are actually my opinion, but are also Bible based. Most of it. This is not. This part, however. But that blue suit and white shirt, and you're going to see why this applies. In my humble opinion, believe that he represents the Democratic Party. And you're going to see more towards why my reasoning of James representing the Democratic Party is in the second part of this. So it won't be in this episode, but the next. Meanwhile, Nefarious / Edward in this movie is seen wearing an orange jumpsuit. You know, the classic orange jumpsuit they have in most movies when you have a prisoner. If it's not orange, then it's like green or it's like tan. But my subconscious questioned and said, why of all colors did they want Edward in this movie to wear orange of all colors? And in my humble opinion, he's wearing orange because it represents masonry. Ooh, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Let's just get started. All right. So, that masonry, in my opinion, will further shed light hmm, on the illumination, or I should say, the angel of light, which is Nefarious's master, Lucifer. So, here are the significant scenes that are noted while I watched this movie that had me legit playing, stopping, writing down quotes for 6.5 hours. Yes, I love you guys that much. The same way that demons don't sleep, neither do I. Because I'm fighting. All right? I'm fighting back. So, the movie starts out, right, with Dr. Fisher. He is the original psychologist that was assigned for the prison evaluation. Now, to set the tone, we have Nefarious, aka Edward, who's in prison. He's in prison because this guy is a murderer in the eyes of the law. He was given a psychological analysis by the original protagonist of the movie, which would have been Dr. Fisher. Dr. Fisher, a psychologist, had already determined by his previous notes that the new story's protagonist, James, that Edward, aka Nefarious, does not, and I repeat, does not deserve to be executed via the electric chair, right? So the movie starts out with Dr. Fisher, the original psychologist assigned for the evaluation for Edward. He was actually either murdered or committed suicide. You don't know initially because the movie literally starts out with Dr. Fisher flying out of a window. Okay? I know. That's super weird. How do you start off a movie with someone literally just flying out a window? But it happened. So, for the viewer's point of view, what happened and why, right? So, the next part of the movie, you see this new psychologist, right, James, make his way into this prison. You have people outside that are basically picketing, they're rioting, they want Edward to be given the electric chair based on the fact that the news and the media is allowing people to see that he's a murderer. He committed 11 murders. And I'll also give the significance as to why that number 11 is so important, right? So the new protagonist, James, is now formally meeting the warden inside the prison now. After he gets his car searched, he's searched, the whole, for anybody who's visited a prison, you know what it's hitting for. Okay. So the warden now has a conversation with James stating that he needs to come up with the end all be all that says, all right, should we give this guy Edward the electric chair or not? But also giving James the warning of before talking to this guy Edward that every time someone is assigned to talk to this guy, something bad happens. So the label given to the warden for Edward is quote unquote a master manipulator. And I need you guys to pay special attention, especially to that word manipulator, because it's going to come very handy for those who didn't watch the movie. You are all bad noodles. So, Edward, according to the warden, is known for twisting people's thoughts. So, the psychologist, this job initially is to figure out if Edward is what you call psychotic or psychogenic. So basically, the difference between the whole theory of psychotic versus psychogenic, meaning, is Edward's crimes against humanity, is the source from his mind, being that he's maybe under some type of distress? Has he been made to be a killer based off his mind and body, like just, betraying him, or is it just circumstantial? So, having that amount of power in your hands to declare if somebody is even competent and basically is able to be put to death, that's a huge responsibility. So, keep that in mind as well. I'm sure this guy, James, is ultimately stressed out, but doesn't even know the stress that he's about to face before meeting Nefarious and Edward, because he's going to meet both. And it's important to note that as well. So, is Edward's mental state his reality, or has it been warped by some type of trauma or stressor? So, upon Edward being introduced to James, Edward, aka Nefarious, because this is Nefarious speaking through Edward, He literally reads him his entire collegiate background, including his professional background, and lets him know subconsciously he knows exactly who he is. So he already knows he's a psychologist, he's never been married, he's like all of this, he's letting him know, which is super weird because how do you know this, sir? Who sent you, fam? Right? So early in his quote unquote interview, Nefarious, through Edward, tells James, the psychologist, that he made the initial psychologist, Dr. Fisher, commit suicide because, quote unquote, that's his purpose. And that he needed Dr. Fisher, the initial psychologist, gone because he needs the new psychologist, James, to do something for him, to write his story. So I'm pretty sure James is like, yo, this guy's bugged out. Ain't nobody prepare me on how crazy this guy is, but let's go. Right? So Nefarious continues to say weird things during the interview. And some of the weird things that I wrote down were that one, death doesn't scare him because he can't die and he's a demon. So Nefarious is explaining through Edward's body to James that he's not scared of death because he can't die, because he's a demon. And also introduces himself as Nefarious, or he's also called, quote unquote, Lord High Prince. He also does not identify with the name of Edward, the body he has taken host of, but only the name his quote unquote master gives him, Nefariamus, meaning he who is nefarious. Stop right there. So, if there's anything I need you guys to take away from what this first part of this nefarious breakdown is the significance of identification, meaning your name, how you feel, how you profess things with your mouth, right? And then also, like our previous episode was with oral consent. Yes, consent can be within the heart as well, but professing it orally, how much power there is within the tongue. And it's actually towards your favor most times if people learn how to shut up. So we about to we about to get into it. Y'all ready or not? Cuz I am. Okay? So he lets it be known that names have power, and Nefarious gets defensive over his name after laughing hysterically when James tries to call him Edward, because he realized in his mind Edward has no authority. You know why? Because Nefarious already took over Edward's body, and Edward has already been enslaved by Nefarious before he even got to prison and ended up where he is right now. Do you know how powerful that is? To be placed in a prison of your own body where you no longer have control, for a demon to take control over you, do all these things that you don't want to do, and have you go to prison to face more damnation. And all this before you even get sent to hell. That's crazy, right? So Nefarious lets James know by the end of the day, he will have committed 3 murders. So stop right there. The reason why that's so significant, right? Nefarious saying out of his own mouth through Edward's body that James, the psychologist, by the end of the day of their interview, he will have committed 3 murders. Also, side note, sidebar, for those who understand and know the Bible, for those that don't, I'm going to explain this to you why this is so significant. Because it almost seems like there's a correlation between the story of Peter denying Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed, like in the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, at the time of Jesus's sentencing. So, a little bit of backstory: Jesus was sentenced to death, hence his crucifixion, right? But mostly, what was his crucifixion and his penalty and him given the death sentence? What was that about? His identity and his plan from his master. Jesus is God in flesh form, carrying out the master's plan, which is God. Nefarious, however, is an amateur compared to Jesus. Because why? Right? Jesus is literally God in flesh. Jesus didn't have to take over a body. Why? Because God created everything, including a way for Jesus to come here and pay the debt for all of us. Versus Nefarious, who tries to mimic things like God and pervert the things of God by entering God's creation through consent from Edward to carry out evil deeds. Both of them were made to stand trial, though. By who? Man, creation. Aha. Okay. So just keep that in mind. So he makes mention to say that he's not saying it will happen because he wants it to, Nefarious, but because, quote unquote, he says so, meaning he will speak it into existence, and Nefarious will subconsciously ask for consent by making his request made known through Satan to James, right? So Nefarious begins to explain to James basically why he's there. So Nefarious states he has been convicted of innumerable murders, right? But 11 within the body he invaded, which is Edward, and he is proud to admit he makes Edward do things he doesn't want to do. Nefarious also explains demonic possession, which James doesn't believe in. So stop right there. This is where it gets funky because this also proves just because you don't believe in something doesn't mean it does not exist. Okay? I could believe right now it's raining, and you can show me outside there is a clear sky with sun. And just because I believe it's raining doesn't mean it's actually raining. You see what I'm saying? To break it down into those terms, right? So let's get back into this. Nefarious explains that he can freely possess anyone and that it only works with consent, with a quote unquote series of yeses and nos. So pay attention to this next part because Nefarious lets it known that demon possession only works with consent and breaks it down like this. So he says, we, quote unquote, meaning a legion of demons, offers a series of temptations that, quote unquote, increase in duration and intensity. So remember how in the last episode I kind of said how God and Satan both work through consent, but God is a gentleman? This guy, Satan, isn't. He's a bully, he's a manipulator. a master manipulator, right? So to offer a series of temptations, that means this guy has nothing but time, right? And according to him, saying that it increases in duration and intensity and also degrades moral integrity. So it also isn't enough that he's getting you to do things, right? Through your consent, though, because he's there to help you out to get you to do these things, but he's going to give you all the credit. He mentions to say it's the easiest to attack people who have the absence of baptism. And the Bible also talked about how there's two types of baptism. There's baptism by water and fire, for those that don't know. So, the baptism by water is what Jesus used to illustrate with John the Baptist, right? With the dove and all of that. You can read it for yourself later because I want to get into this. But also by fire, which didn't come about until Jesus ascended to the Father after his death and then let the Holy Spirit take his place on earth. Then, after a while, people were baptized in fire through the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit. And Nefarious continues to explain how this allows demons to work on a person even before the age of reason. So before someone can formally be baptized and make a clear distinction that they want to follow in God's salvation that he left for us, before a person even reaches the age of reason, which he believes is somewhere between ages 3 through 5, he already starts to plant seeds of temptation there. Now, side note, sidebar, the age of reason is also the title of a book written by Thomas Paine, for all of my scholars out there. Revenge of the Nerds, what's up? So, Thomas Paine was the author of the book The Age of Reason and is the father of the idea that the supernatural occurrences from the Bible were nothing but anecdotes or an extension of mythology, which Nefarious plays upon. He plays upon the idea of, oh, you don't believe? Good, good. I'm happy you don't believe because now I'm about to turn up in your face. And your disbelief is your downfall as a creation, right? Because it's easier to get people to believe that Satan doesn't exist instead of believing in God's existence. Even when it's right in your face, your belief or disbelief will ultimately determine where you're going spiritually, right? So Nefarious continues explaining and makes light of how he infiltrated Edward's body through means of decision making and gives examples like when Edward decided to steal a toy car at the age of 3, because remember, 3 starts that kind of range according to Nefarious of that age of reason. So to steal a car at 3, he already made a conscious decision of temptation and gave Nefarious consent to follow him. Or Nefarious says at age 8 when he accepted a Ouija board from his grandmother. Now, I don't have to explain the significance of a Ouija board, but for those of you who have no idea, again, this right here is not for children, and I say anybody under the age of 18. So if you're listening to this and you want to go to bed at night, I suggest you turn this off and let mom or dad or whoever stay. All right? Fair warning. But just him playing with a Ouija board, how so many people think it's a game to be out here communicating with spirits, both malevolent and benevolent, but mostly malevolent. Okay? You do not do anything as far as the spirit world without consenting God the Almighty, because you are asking for trouble. Okay? So that seed that was planted to gain immediate access to his decision making through consent with those yeses and quote unquote few enough no's. Satan knows how to get you. He knows you better than you know you, but you know who knows you ultimately more than anybody else? God, because you're his creation. But what is Satan's job? To permeate and to flip the script. He wants to destroy you by any means necessary, right? So Nefarious made mention that demons work so incrementally that no one in Edward's immediate contact actually noticed the small changes that were happening. And he also makes mention that he works in degrees. Ah, you see degrees come up. Degrees, which can also allude to possibly more than one thing, like the degrees of masonry or the stages and characteristics of where one is in his or her life. Okay? So here is where, in the next scene, Nefarious begins to explain from quote unquote top to bottom of the process of taking over one's body. So here it goes. So, number one, this is 1 through 5. Number one, extreme temptation. So, let's go back to Edward's life. The guy who is being sentenced to the electric chair that Nefarious took over his body. It all started with a car at age 3. Okay? And through time of a series of yeses and very few no's begins the next step, obsession, right? So I just happened to look in the dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary for each. So obsession, to preoccupy or fill the mind continually, intrusively. So imagine just one simple thought intruding your mind all the time, day and night. It could be a thing or a person. It could be that one person you're just like, wow, I enjoy speaking with them. I can't help myself going a day without talking to them. And let it be known, obsessions can be good or bad. I can be obsessed about talking about God all day. Or I can be obsessed with talking to Satan all day. Again, this all goes back to consent. Now let's look at the next step, infestation. The Oxford Dictionary writes the presence of unusually large number of pests in one place at one time. Now, I'm pretty sure that you know by now when I mean infestation, I'm not talking about roaches, bed bugs, termites. If you got them, listen, it's okay. Just don't invite me over. But in this instance, right, excluding Oxford's dictionary, we are talking about the presence of demons, which I will get to later by explaining what a legion of demons means, okay? So, after infestation is the next step, which is possession. So, the Oxford Dictionary writes having, owning, and controlling someone or something, which in essence we are literally watching in this movie Nefarious or Nefariamus intrude, own, and control Edward. his body, his mind, and ultimately his spirit. Correct? Now, here comes the last step of the five, subjugation, which the Oxford Dictionary expresses to bring under domination or control by conquest. When you hear the word conquest, what should go off in your mind was there was a fight and someone lost. Because if there's one thing that we should take a hold as far as history, history is always written in the penmanship of the conqueror. So, what does Nefarious want at the end all be all? To spread his master's will by what? A book that he wants written not by him or Edward, but through the eyes of James, the new protagonist. So keep that in mind, right? So here comes the next scene. Nefarious, after explaining these stages, admits, quote unquote, we own Edward, referring to demons and his master, who is Satan. So James, the protagonist, the new psychologist, starts to shift the conversation by asking why Nefarious decided to off Dr. Fisher, especially because Dr. Fisher was the one, according to his notes, he was going to help him be labeled clinically unfit to stand execution or the electric chair. And Nefarious explains to James that he actually wants to be executed. So James, after hearing this, is visibly confused because he understood that if Nefarious is the demon in Edward's body that he claims to be, then he can't die. But where would that leave Nefarious if Edward dies? So Nefarious reassures James by saying, well, I can't die. However, Edward can, saying, quote unquote, we no longer need him. And our work with him is done. And it's time for Edward to go to hell. Yo, what? Mind you, all of this is taking place. This is like the first 15 to 25 minutes of the movie. Okay? Sick. This guy is sick. Nefarious. I can't even say this guy. This demon is sick, right? So at this time, James is visibly upset by what Nefarious has just told him, and he decides to use a radio to ask if there is a nearby chaplain or priest so that they can, get some insight because James, being a devout atheist, while he's understanding or trying to understand what he's saying, he doesn't have the belief. He still has an issue with belief, right? So he uses the radio and decides to ask, hey, is there anyone that can come in? We have a chaplain on the premises. And they tell him, yeah, like he actually just got in. He just arrived, right? So Nefarious is pissed off. Like he is completely PO'd and asks, why did he decide to do that? And James mentions that he doesn't specialize in theology. James wanted help with the chaplain to determine whether or not he is fit to stand execution or be criminally unfit via the whole basically notion, is this spirit derived or is this a mental thing? So that disbelief, even though all the evidence is right in my guy's face, he's still just like, okay, is someone who believes thoroughly and represents the belief in theology Are they able to help me determine if this is theology based, or is it more my expertise where it's mentally, right? So James is told by Nefarious that that's not a good idea. He's pissed. James immediately feels threatened, and Nefarious decides to admit, yeah, I'm threatening you, basically. James decides to disclose to Nefarious that he's an atheist, so he professes it and gives consent to let Nefarious know out of his own mouth he is an atheist. Now you're about to see his downfall. Nefarious becomes angry and calls James ignorant and that his atheism won't protect him, right? So James begins to try to clarify to Nefarious the initial reason why he's there to interview him again. James explains that he, quote unquote, has the power to save or condemn him. So stop right there. Why is that so important? And for those who know the Bible, y'all already know why this is important, right? Going back to the similarities between Nefarious and Jesus. This is similar to the execution of Christ and the decision making that was given to none other than Pontius Pilate in Matthew chapter 27. See, in Matthew chapter 27, Pontius Pilate was one of the last people that Jesus went to see in order to get the final say so of whether Jesus should be crucified or not. And notably, Pontius Pilate, the only thing he did was literally ask Jesus, is it true what they say about you? And Jesus was like, if you say. He knows ultimately his fate is not decided by man, but by God, because God already gave him the game plan of what he's supposed to do. Jesus, all he had to do was make sure that the plan was executed the same way in which Nefarious understands that his master Satan sent him for a reason to continue out the plan through Edward. But when Edward is no longer, he still has to continue the plan through who? James, right? All about consent. Even Jesus gave Pontius Pilate the consent to do whatever he wanted because at the end all be all, he knew God had his back 100 and he had to do what he had to do. So Nefarious continues to taunt James, telling him he would have no power over him if it wasn't already authorized from quote unquote below, meaning from hell. So even Nefarious knows James has no authority, even on earth, being that he has the title or the quote unquote authorization to put him to death. He's like, yo, I'm not even scared of you. You can't put me to death. You could put Edward to death, but you can't do nothing to me. Think about that. He's not scared of him, right? So as Nefarious finished speaking, a light bulb in the room increases in light and in noise and in frequency, and then blows out and breaks, and the glass shatters on the floor. Nefarious taunts him, James, again saying, quote unquote, probably just a coincidence, Jimmy. So he's literally showing he has no power and he has all power over him because of his disbelief, and through consent orally decides to tell him that he's not scared of him, even as far as a light bulb in that room. Okay? So shortly after, the chaplain comes in and Nefarious gets up and he's agitated and he starts yelling that no one wants him here and he isn't needed. So, going back to the concept of consent, James looks Nefarious in the face, letting him know, I summoned him. So, that right there was the perfect representation. Whether you know it or not, God can use anyone and anything at any time to conquer Satan. But man is ultimately his own downfall, because look at this, right? The chaplain introduces himself to James as Lou. So here's what I want to look into, right? Now, I'm a person who's very much into names because names hold power and they hold meaning, right? So let's just look at all the names of the characters so far, except for Nefarious, because we already described what his name means. Now, Lou, being the chaplain or the priest, his name, right, actually means famous warrior. Now, why is that significant? Because a chaplain or a priest is already supposed to be familiarized with how to fight spiritually. But get this, Nefarious, knowing who the chaplain is and what he represents, asks verbatim, what do you want with me, son of God? So Nefarious is literally shaking in his boots because he really wants to know. He's trying to check the priest's temperature. Like, okay, is this guy is he the real deal? Can he possess the power to cast me out the same way Jesus did in Mark chapter 5? Or is he a fraud? Let me check his temperature, right? So he asks, what do you want with me, son of God? And asks if he came to torture him while he's still standing angrily. James explains Nefarious's obsession of identifying himself as a demon to Lou, which Nefarious refuses to use the name of Jesus, saying, quote unquote, the carpenter sent you to gloat. Stop right there. So even Nefarious, understanding the power of names, introducing himself as the Lord High Prince and Nefariamus, he who is nefarious, refuses to use the name Jesus and tells Lou, the spiritual warrior, the carpenter sent you to gloat. Think about that. And he admits to Lou that he's a high ranking demon because he's not able to easily be casted out. So Nefarious he's been thugging with his rounds out here on Earth. Lord knows he said he's committed innumerable amounts of murders before Edward's little 11 murders. You see what I'm saying? To go back to look at previous context. He just wants to know, yo, you got the power to cast me out or not? Or can I sit back down? That's all he wants to know. Right? So the chaplain, here's here's where I was disappointed. I wanted to jump through this screen and mollywop my guy. Okay? The chaplain identifies insanity, or that insanity has always been an issue thanks to pop culture, movies, TV shows, and other forms of media. Lou, the chaplain, speaks to Edward and admits that he has never taken part of an exorcism, nor is he an exorcist, and explains to Edward/Nefarious that many things that bother us are just experiences and or thoughts. So you see, you have a whole priest in this modern day who let secular pop culture, or pop culture, I should say, outside of the church, be fused with his fake spirituality, and now he's powerless. Nefarious is confused, and he begins to sit back down and asks if the chaplain believes in demonic possession, if he believes it can even be considered a part of insanity. So you see, he's comfortable now because he realized, as far as this guy being a warrior for Christ, as his name suggests and how his title suggests, he's a fraud. So the chaplain, Lou, explains his belief in a sort of new age science of understanding. As Nefarious says, I appreciate you telling me that, quote unquote. Ah. So it wasn't enough for Nefarious to say, okay, this guy's a phony. He had to profess it through consent with his mouth that he's a phony and he does not believe in demonic possession in order for him to do what he's about to do next. I want y'all to pay attention to that, right? So Nefarious is clearly happy knowing that at least amongst this chaplain Lou that he is safe. Nefarious calls Lou, his first name, that he was wrong about him and he should have let him visit previously. So he lets the audience know Nefarious was very much scary as far as meeting the chaplain because he knew that him being a priest, he may or may not have had the power to cast him out. But knowing that he has no power because he don't even believe in demonic possession, I should have met you a long time ago, Lou. He has no problem calling him by his first name now. Right? So Nefarious dismissed the chaplain after realizing he holds no true power over him. Lou lets Edward know if he needs him to reach out to Nefarious, right? That he's going to be available, and cuts him off. Nefarious cuts him off to shake Lou's hand, and Lou backs away scared. Nefarious is low-key allowing him access to even touch Edward's body after finding out he has no power to cast him out of Edward. Because demons work through consent in more than one way, not just through words. It can be also through physical touch. Hence, when people lay hands to cast demons out, that is very much a thing. So Lou says he will be available right up until the time he's sent for execution. Nefarious interrupts and says the word, quote unquote, sizzle. Right up until he sizzles, which is a double entendre between the electric chair and also Nefarious completing his mission to get Edward to die and be sent to hell. Okay? So we have the next scene. Lou then leaves, and James, who is waiting patiently and observing everything in the corner, sits back down and tells Father Lou, that doesn't believe in the power of demons, that it's been a pleasure having him here. Nefarious angrily explains that it doesn't mean anything and that he refuses to go anywhere. Ah. So now he's good and comfortable. He's sitting down at Edward's body. Yeah. you tried it, James. I was pissed off with you before, but I ain't going nowhere. Right? Nefarious states, quote unquote, you still have to deal with me. To which James labels him irrational. And Nefarious states, quote unquote, I am the most rational being you will ever meet. James asks if Nefarious can provide proof so that he can believe what he is saying is rational and to prove he's a demon. And Nefarious states verbatim, all right, let me in, exercising that the point of demonic possession always starts with consent, the same way God works through consent. Nefarious says, quote unquote, let me inhabit you, asking consent from James. James replies, I'm not going to do that. Nefarious taunts James, why not? I thought you're an atheist, remember? And this is how people who understand the Bible, this is where we're going to laugh, right? Because we realize Nefarious is literally representing the devil and all of the devil's ways. And his ways hasn't changed. From the very start of creation till now, his ways has not changed. All he does is takes God's ways and perverts it. Here's how, right? When you see God in flesh, aka Jesus, when he came down to explain the ways of how the Father works, when people asked him questions, specifically the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the ones who were the keeper of the law, and very upstanding citizens. These are the people who can recite the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, forwards and backwards, right? They're very prestigious, very, very, very religious, right? When they would question Jesus and Jesus would answer back with a question, Satan knows how to do the same thing. He takes God's logic, right? God's logic and reasoning, and in order to get you to second guess yourself, what does he do? He questions it. Why not, James? I thought you're an atheist, remember? You see that? It's always a different day, same tricks with the devil, yo. It's the same tricks. So James says he's not going to play nefarious games. And he claps back and he says he's already playing. Nefarious goes, you're already playing, quote unquote. You might as well play by the rules and invite me in. So James sternly says no. And Nefarious continues calling James a poser, just like Lou, the chaplain priest, and says, quote unquote, he's afraid to test the validity of your own convictions. Basically saying, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid to prove yourself wrong? Right, James? Right, Jimmy? You afraid? Taunting him, right? So James allows consent, saying, with his mouth, quote unquote, if I agree, I get to make a request as well. This is where he messed up, y'all. So Nefarious laughs because all it took was him to question his logic for him to fold on his faith, what was right smack in between his eyes, sitting right in front of him. He low-key already knew, James, in his subconscious, the truth that Nefarious is actually a demon, but he allowed consent for Nefarious to work through him if he made a proposition, which is the devil is great at making deals, right? Did he not try to make a deal after a 40-day fast in the desert with Jesus, promising everything to be king and have money over the earth and all that? And the devil taunted him, knowing he was at his weakest point after 40 days of not eating or drinking, right? He came to James at his weakest. Nefarious came to James at his weakest point. You're about to see why this is his weakest point in his life right now, right? So back to this next scene. Nefarious admits he's beginning to like James and says, quote unquote, I agree, confirming the approval of his proposition and that Nefarious can inhabit him. James begins to mock Nefarious, telling him, go ahead, inhabit me, not understanding what his doubt has created, and continues saying, you have my complete unfettered and irrevocable permission. Go ahead, what are you waiting for? End quote. Nefarious, his face visibly starts to change and looks somewhat relieved as he pauses and says absolutely nothing with his mouth gaped open as James continues to now taunt Nefarious with what he's saying. So James suspects that nothing will happen to him, and Nefarious tells him not to gloat. James tells him that Nefarious was supposed to prove he is a demon, but he's only wasting his time. And James says, quote unquote, my turn, as he says he would like to speak specifically to Edward Wayne Brady, whose body Nefarious is torturing and is using to carry out evil on the earth. So, pause. Remember, I told you how names have such a unique, unique, unique purpose, right? So, just to save you some time, side note, sidebar, I went ahead and looked up the meaning of both James and also Edward, right? Here's what I found. James is a classic, traditional, and biblical name, like Saint James, meaning supplanter or replacer. Who did James replace? Dr. Fisher. But also, take a look at this, right? James is also a derivative of the name Jacob, as in Jacob's ladder. What did Jacob's ladder represent? The direct line between earth and heaven. Aha! Aha! I broke the code again, right? Thank you, Holy Spirit. This is what happens when you pray before you read the Bible and or partake in anything. Because this is beyond my understanding. This is what the Holy Spirit gave to me. Amen. So we also have the name Edward, right? So, what is the meaning of Edward? Edward is a male given name of Old English origin, meaning wealth, fortune, or prosperous, also meaning guardian or protector. That second one, guardian or protector. What is Edward protecting, in essence? The identity of Nefarious, right? He's guarding the evil, malevolent spirit of Nefarious, but guess who's footing the bill for the consequences? Edward. There you go. Right? Sick. Sick. And just to one up y'all, I also happen to look into what the name of Jesus means and why Nefarious refuses to use the name Jesus and instead uses the term the carpenter, right? Jesus literally means Savior or the Lord is salvation. If He is the Lord of salvation and His master carried out His plans through Nefarious and a legion of demons that He's supposed to help destroy creation, why would He want to identify Him as the Savior then? And also, by definition, a legion is a large unit of soldiers or spirits that could average out to be thousands. So he doesn't work alone. God doesn't work alone, and neither does Satan. You see this? God can have a legion of angels, and the devil can have a legion of demons. And that, my friends, is how Satan works. He takes everything God has and he perverts it right in front of your face in this movie, and they explain it so eloquently without explaining it. It's just in your face. Whether you believe it or not, it is what it is. Okay? So, back to these scenes now, right? So, Nefarious, right, still decides that he's playing around. James saying, "Hey, it's my turn," right? And he wants to speak to Edward Wayne Brady. He gave his full legal name and consented. "I want to specifically speak to Edward Wayne Brady, whose body Nefarious is torturing and is using to carry out his evil on Earth." And just to enable the viewer to see the difference between the two characters in one body, Nefarious and Edward, I love what the director does in this movie. So, with the point of view of James, they angle the camera behind James to span out. So it goes from left to right, where you see Edward's face changed from Nefarious, his mannerisms and everything. He slowly, behind James's back to the other side, you see him turn into to Edward, and he starts crying. And I said, "Wow, this is literally giving me Joker vibes, Heath Ledger, the split personality, just like that." And I'm like, "Ooh, this guy is good. Ooh, he's good. Ooh, he got it. Great actor," right? So Edward says Nefarious is angry and that, quote unquote, "he's going to do bad things to you. You should listen to him when he says stuff like that. He means it." End quote. Hmm. So, on top of being inhabited by a demon and sharing your body with a demon, you don't have control of your mind. You don't have control of your body. You don't have control of your spirit. And this guy, I mean, this demon continues to come in and leave whenever he pleases just to upset you because he hates you that much, right? And just humanity altogether. It's not too personal. It's personal, but not that personal, right? So Edward states Nefarious makes him do bad things that Edward doesn't want to do. And for clarity, James asks at that moment who he was speaking with while getting his pen ready to jot down notes for his final analysis for the warden. Hmm. Edward then confirms to James that he is speaking with Edward while he's stuttering and he's visibly scared. He's shaking. He's crying. He's shaking. He's paranoid because he knows if he even slips up and says the wrong thing, Nefarious will come for him, right? James speaks to Edward asking if Dr. Fisher had ever explained to him the term dissociative disorder and how people who experience trauma use multiple personalities to help them cope. Edward yells that he doesn't have that, and James asks Edward, who is Nefarious? Edward is still visibly shaken, and he gets up and tells James, "I'm not supposed to talk about him." Edward was already made a prisoner to Nefarious before being in prison. He mentions how he is helpless because of Nefarious and makes him he does bad things. And he tells James, quote unquote, "he owns me." James asks if Edward likes Dr. Fisher, and Edward says, quote unquote, "he was nice." James then explains to Dr. Fisher that he didn't think Nefarious was real, and how Dr. Fisher refused to believe Edward when trying to explain how Nefarious is a demon who has infiltrated him. James then asks Edward where Nefarious is, to which he says he's always listening, and says sometimes he leaves Edward alone so he can experience pain. Edward explains Nefarious does bad things through him, but then will leave Edward to deal with the consequences or penalties involved. It has resulted in other inmates getting angry and beating Edward, and resulted in him going into solitary confinement. And Edward explains Nefarious likes when that happens. James now says he would like to learn more about Edward and wants to stay away from the topic of Nefarious. He asks Edward about his childhood, to which Edward replies, quote unquote, short. Nefarious now speaks to Edward by telling him mentally that James is going to off him and that James has the power to stop this but won't, which is a lie, right? Because ultimately, James just wants to know why this guy is being tormented. He still doesn't believe that it's through a spirit, but by his own mind. But Nefarious, this demon who's tormenting him, is lying to Edward in his mind while he's giving him the authorization to speak, saying, yo, this guy has the power to stop all of this, and he's still letting you suffer. Lying to him, right? So James says the reason this interview is happening is to decide, hence the convo. James brings up that they have to talk about the murders that Ed committed because Edward blames Nefarious for them. So Edward says Nefarious is bad for making him do that, but James asked Edward if Edward thinks he's bad. So Edward admits he is bad because he's done things he isn't proud of, and he continues to cry and stutter. And Nefarious quickly re-enters Edward's body and immediately stops crying, saying, quote unquote, I didn't kill my mother. And this is when the director pans the camera back from right to left to show the transition from Edward back to Nefarious. Crazy. This is where it starts to get extra, right? So, right when the camera pans back from right to left and Nefarious re enters Edward's body, again, he immediately stops crying. So, we know Edwin's there when he starts crying and stuttering because he's suffering. He stops crying and stuttering. Nefarious is back. And again, he says, quote unquote, I didn't kill my mother. Nefarious then tells James he's finished allowing James to speak with Edward, not caring that James isn't finished with his interview for the time being. Nefarious asks, quote unquote, how is she? Which James says, being that you know all about me, I would assume you know that my mom is dead. Nefarious taunts James by telling him, quote unquote, you know how you said you'd never kill anyone? And he calls James a liar. Nefarious explains how James offed his own mom because 10 years ago he was brought up on first-degree murder charges, but James says it was lawful to euthanize his mother. So the whole beginning of the movie, Nefarious, remember, tells James, you're going to kill 3 people by the end of today. There's going to be 3 murders committed by you, James. James refused to believe it, but now Nefarious is already telling him, you already committed 1 murder, your mom, because you had her euthanized, right? So Nefarious explains that just because something is lawful doesn't make it morally acceptable. Hmm. And again, I'm going to use the comparison of good versus evil, Jesus versus Nefarious, because guess what? The whole reason Jesus came to earth was to separate the Old Testament from the New. The Old Testament, like I said in the last episode, represents law, and how you have the religious leaders who were still following and living under the law of Moses and all those 666 laws that came before 10 commandments and all of those things. They were still living under those laws of the Torah, the first 5 books, right? But Jesus came and said, we need to stop living under law. And in this New Testament, after my passing, we need to live under grace. Grace is the forgiveness of things that are done wrong. But you can only obtain that forgiveness by one, forgiving yourself and others, then receiving forgiveness from me. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one even gets to the Father but through him, right? So, Nefarious explaining that just because something is lawful doesn't make it morally acceptable is true, because even demons, though they like to lie and twist truth, doesn't mean they never tell the truth. He knows in order to get you to go with him to where his master is, he needs to what? Be the quote unquote master manipulator that the warden declared he was, and that his master wants him to be. Aha. Aha. Okay? Now, James justifies his decision of euthanization for his mother by saying his mother was in pain and her prognosis was terminal, meaning she was gonna die regardless. Might as well take her out, right? According to him. So Nefarious states that James also was a benefactor for money, being that he was her sole heir. So it would even make more sense to go ahead and offer, knowing that you were her only heir and there was money involved, right, Jimmy? Yo, he called him out. So Nefarious continues to taunt him by saying that his mom was old and inconvenient, and which ties into the Bible on how children who honor and obey their parents live long lives. Ephesians 6, 1 through 3, right? But Nefarious criticizes James while saying his mom would have died sooner or later and that he would have made the same choice. Right? Oh, Jimmy, I would have made the same choice. She was going to die regardless. It's terminal, right? Just pacifying him. Just to say, you made the wrong choice. I would have done the same thing as a demon. So James asks why Nefarious is bringing this up, and Nefarious explains, like he did earlier, that before he leaves today, James will have committed 3 murders. So now, we as the audience gets clarity that the murders that James commit may not have been done by his hand, by what? His authority and consent from his heart and his mouth. Again, it all goes back to consent. Okay? Selah. So Nefarious explains the first murder James committed was with his mother. So his prophecy is quote unquote moving along nicely. So James, in a fit of rage, gets up and tells Nefarious he didn't off his mom and throws the radio across the room. So Nefarious tells James, quote unquote, Feel free to take a break. I'll be here when you get back. So James then takes the walkie talkie he flung across the floor, sits back down, and continues his interview. Nefarious asks if James is ready for round two, to which James says, quote unquote, I didn't know this was a fight. And Nefarious says, quote unquote, that's why you're losing. Ah, so you see, even Nefarious knows this is a spiritual battle. This has nothing to do with intellect. This has nothing to do with mental illness. This has everything to do with spirit. And this is staring him directly in the face. And James, still at this point in the movie, refuses to believe his own eyes, his own ears of what's going on, even though he explained to him from quote unquote top to bottom how this guy operates. He still doesn't want to believe. That right there, you see, James, he has the spirit of Thomas. Thomas was one of the 12 disciples who was known as the doubter. You had to prove everything to him. He was going to doubt everything, down to Jesus' resurrection, asking him if he could feel the palms of his hand to know where the nail-pierced hand, the nails had penetrated Jesus' hands. He is the doubter. But guess what? Jesus doesn't necessarily need your consent to believe. He's going to do what he wants to do, however he wants to do it, and he's going to work through whoever he wants to. The same way Nefarious does and his master. You get it? So the next scene, right? Before I even get there, I want to explain the significance and how to fight spiritually, because you're just going to need this to know. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Bible, that's cool. We're about to walk hand in hand. And this is why this is part of my self-love series. Part of self-love is including how you need to know how to fight, how to prepare yourself so you can fight spiritually for you. You can worry about the rest of the type of relationships around you later, but first you have to worry about you and your relationship with God, right? So right there, being suited and booted up to fight, right, can be illustrated in the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verses 13 through 20. I won't read it, but I'll tell you what to take apart from it. So here are the following things that are used to fight spiritually. You have 1, the truth. 2, righteousness, living the right way within God's will. 3, the gospel of peace. 4, by faith. 5, salvation. And 6, through prayer. That conversation between just you and God where you don't hear anybody's voice but God's. And it's going to take some time, but the more you flex that muscle, the more you use that muscle, the easier it is to use. Okay? So back to the next scene. James tries to save face for and apologizes for his previous outburst, him throwing the radio and all that about his mom, but assures Nefarious that his private affairs are no longer to be mentioned for the duration of Nefarious's interview. So James explains he is simply here appointed by a judge to evaluate Ed's sanity, to determine if Edward's eligibility for execution based on the state of Oklahoma. There was already an execution scheduled for 11 p.m. and that he is in control of the assessment. So side note, sidebar, it's important to mention that most believe we are at the 11th hour in terms of the time we live in before Christ's return, but many don't know the spiritual significance, far as the Bible anyway. I know many may have explained to you numerology, but not Bible based numerology. Because again, the Bible intended to be a roadmap to salvation through spirit. But again, everything that God uses, the devil perverts. So he has his own numerology. But through God's numerology, right? The number 11 represents duality between heaven and hell, heaven and earth and hell. But 11 also represents chaos, disorder, and judgment, which is fitting for the context of what's going on between Nefarious and Edward, right? Edward is technically at his 11th hour before what inevitably happens to him. So James makes himself clear with his intentions while Nefarious continues to taunt and whisper, quote unquote, "We're done talking about your mommy," end quote. James continues asking Nefarious questions, suggesting he still doesn't want to believe Nefarious is a demon and that he's just another quote unquote split personality. Nefarious argues, saying Edward doesn't have dissociative identity disorder and that he's more than aware of the 5+ disorders mentioned in the DSM that are classified. And the DSM, for those who don't know, is literally a huge book defining all types of disorders. So if you don't know about it, there's ways you can look that up or just ask any medical professional. They'll be able to at least give you somewhat of what the DSM is. Very important, by the way, for the medical field. Shout out to all the medical professionals listening to this. Okay? Y'all the real track stars. But anyway, Nefarious argues, saying Edward, doesn't have dissociative identity disorder, and that, yes, he's aware of them, of what they are. And James asked Nefarious if he still thinks a demon knowing all that he knows about disorders. So you're still asking a demon all that he knows about disorders, still not realizing that he's been talking to you for what, 45 minutes at this point in the movie? Something like that. So Nefarious explains verbatim, a demon who understands the value of patience, was his response when James asked why he hasn't inhabited him already. And see, this is where most of us are messed up in society right now. Think about all the things that you have instantly in access to you, whether it be pictures, news, food, right? We've been conditioned to lack patience. But guess who has the ultimate patience that preys upon you? Demons and Satan. Ooh, you know what? That water though, where I put my water at? Because baby, So the next scene, James asks why Nefarious chose him of all people to come. And Nefarious explains again he chose him to tell his story and that James is going to write Nefarious's book. So Nefarious taunts James again, saying how it will be ironic that a quote unquote devout atheist will bring forth a demon's manifesto, end quote. And then here's the part I found the most hilarious, right? So James states his quote unquote capacity for self delusion is impressive, end quote. And Nefarious replies, ditto. So Nefarious Loki is like, not you calling me delusional. and it being impressive when you're the one who's literally delusional and doesn't know what's going on. Don't come for me and my legion. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the next scene, right? And we're going to wrap this up because I'm going to start part two probably within the next 15 to 20 minutes. So just wait on it. It gets crazier. Okay. Y'all gotta watch this movie if you haven't. I know I spoiled like half of it, but you gotta watch it, okay? So Nefarious knows James is a victim of modern day science, ideology, and law instead of spirituality, discernment, and grace, which are the principles of who he calls the quote unquote carpenter. That's why Jesus came to earth, right? And Nefarious explains compared to him, James and all of humanity are inferior by design. So James mentions his use of the quote unquote designer because that's who he calls God. He doesn't want to call God God. He calls him the designer because he's the creator, right? So James mentioned his use of designer, admits there being a designer, and says Nefarious must believe in the existence of a creator. So Nefarious says, quote unquote, unfortunately for both of us, he exists, alluding to the fact that judgment for both is around the corner. James is taken aback that Nefarious would acknowledge such a thing because it wouldn't seem like theology would be spoken about by a quote unquote demon. But Nefarious brags that he knows more about theology than any human being ever has. James speaks on Nefarious and the concept of him being cast out of heaven with Lucifer and all that, only for him to lose the battle between good and evil. So he thinks. But Nefarious explains there's much more to the story, and he begins to share his perspective. So Nefarious explains to him and all the demons and Lucifer's rebellion that it makes sense because pearls before swine. This right there, his quote unquote saying pearls before swine, is literally evidence that demons and the devil know the Bible and wicked people know the Bible better than you and me. Okay? Pearls before swine is literally a quote from Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. Okay? And it speaks on people who offer valuable things to those who don't understand. Casting pearls before swine. It's me dropping gems to you to people who don't understand. It's kind of like him saying, I don't even know why I bother to do this. Cause you're still not getting it. You're a dummy. You're a big dummy. This is basically what Nefarious just told him. Right? So James says he must explain so that if he's going to write Nefarious's book, well, he has to know what he's talking about, right? So that was really James's way of being slick and digging into Nefarious's head to get his conclusion to be sent to the warden. So here goes Nefarious speaking about quote unquote our creation, which were demons. So, right? He created God before creating the universe, like everything was explained in Genesis, right? Nefarious explains there were angels with free will, and they recognized another type of will, which is God's, or what Nefarious quotes as the enemy's will, because, well, he's a demon, so he's not going to acknowledge God. But For reference, I threw that in there. So he explains how Lucifer held a rebellion and told them that free will should be above God's will and that their creation would mean, quote unquote, eternal gratitude, worship, and forced servitude, end quote, which is AKA slavery to angels, allegedly, right? So he goes, well, why give us free will if we can't use it? In Nefarious's words. And James seems to have agreed. However, Isaiah chapter 55, verses 6 through 9, explains how God's ways are best and his ways are not our ways, right? Side note, sidebar. And Nefarious explains that the angels were, quote unquote, threatened to obey God's will or be condemned, and there's no second chances. And despite how humans are given a second chance over and over again, they're given love and mercy, they weren't, which logically would seem unfair. So James asked if Nefarious, right? James asked Nefarious if hell is like a physical place or is it a state of being? To which Nefarious replies, yes. So James is like, well, which one is it? And Nefarious replies, it's both. So Nefarious explains time there is immeasurable and there was no opposition really until man was created. So for the most like for the most part, time is immeasurable in heaven or in hell. But the real beef didn't even start of them being casted out of heaven until man was created, right? So Satan was upset because instead of a second chance, he created man who was given grace and said through Nefarious, quote unquote, it was a slap in the face for who? Fallen angels. And Satan knew if he can or could make men disobey, then his fate would mirror demons, which would mean man would fall and be condemned into all damnation eternally, which is hell. And he mentions man being made in God's image while being given dominion over the earth, over nature, becoming, and demons really just becoming slave to men and animals, and letting it be known, but those who sin became one with those who were cast down to hell with Satan. So Nefarious explains helping man sin would quote unquote become our forever mission, end quote. So Nefarious says he made you in his image, but we've remade you in ours, letting it be known that sin really perverts God's nature. And Nefarious explains we hurt you to hurt the carpenter and the creator by destroying what he loves, which is humanity. You're nothing but a means to an end, end quote. James believes his work is done as far as the interview, and Nefarious thinks otherwise. James believes that Edward believes what he's saying, as Nefarious believe, like he's just like, yo, this guy really feels like this guy is just a whole demon. He's not fit to stand execution. This is not just him acting this way under stress. This is really a mental problem that he has. So he's kind of facing the reality that, yo, I think he's innocent, right? But James Although he wants to concur with Dr. Fisher's findings that Ed is mentally incompetent, which would make him unfit for the electric chair, Nefarious doesn't want that. And James says that to make him competent to stand execution would be murder. So Nefarious taunts him and says, well, well, why? It wasn't a problem, killing your mom for $3.6 million. So he's continuing to taunt him every time he starts to think, okay, it's just he's just mentally unstable, instead of recognizing him like, yo, we gotta off this guy. So Nefarious says, I told you before you leave here today, you will have completed 3 murders. So there was already his mother, and this alludes to Nefarious stating that he understands where the second murder is going to come from, which I'm going to break apart into a track number 2. And I will see you guys shortly. Until next time, bye bye. Later, track stars.